Hi, my name's Mike Parker from Mining Footprint Limited, and we're continuing our series on examining mining issues through the lens of international relations theory. As usual, I'm joined this week by our international relations practitioner, Jake Erickson. Hi Jake, how's it going?
Doing well. Looking forward to today's discussion, Mike.
Excellent. This week we're going to delve into the theory of postcolonialism. Now Jake, just tell us about postcolonialism, its theory and what it means and how we can apply it to conditions in the world today.
To really talk about postcolonialism and postcolonial theory, we need to understand what the colonial system was predicated on. The colonial era refers to a time in our world's past when imperial states, primarily in Europe, operated colonies outside of national borders in the form of land territories whose economic monetary systems were centralized back in the colonial states. So when we talk about the colonial system, we're talking about a hegemonic, a colonial hegemon in which this entire system is predicated on inequality, an unequal relationship between the colony and the colonist. The inequality doesn't necessarily have to do with poverty, although you certainly could make that argument. It's a broader structure in which one actor is in a subservient role to the other. And so all of the initial outreach and different economic systems, legislation that was put in place to sort of govern these colonies was predicated on, again, that unequal relationship. And that includes legislation in the mining industries. So a lot of the laws that we see governing the way the industry operates came about during the colonial era, right? When these countries first came into being, their first initial interaction with the open market was in the form of providing their natural resources to the colonial state, i.e. the metropole core. And the colonial hegemon deconstructed when sovereignty was given to the colonial states. As soon as the states have their own form of sovereignty and they can be considered a true country in this international system, then the colonial era is officially over. You still might have engagements, interactions with other states that look colonial, i.e. post-colonial, but they're not considered colonial relationships because the former colony now has country-like sovereignty. So a big discussion in international relations is what current themes, what current behaviors, trends are baked into the way that these countries interact with one another, and to what degree does that reflect colonial pasts. So there wasn't much of a goal in the colonizing states to actually build institutions or build diversified economies that could sort of expand a middle class or create a large economic foundation for a successful state to sort of emerge out of the ashes, right? You didn't. If we were to actually put that into practice, that explanation, or to try to visualize that, we only have to refer to instances or maps that actually visualize the colonial system. And what's important to note is there are very few countries in the world that were not impacted in some way by the colonial system. In fact, only 2 countries in Africa failed to be colonized by the Europeans. So if a majority of the world's countries in some way, shape, or form were impacted by colonialism or were themselves colonies, then we need to understand the theories that evolved from that era to be able to explain ongoing trends that we seem to see, which I'm sure you can speak more to, Mike.
Yeah, just looking at the map, the former colonies are the areas in the world where there's the most persistent and widespread poverty. The states that are most likely to be weak and to fail come from those former colonies. And most of the human rights violations on a large scale in today's world seem to take place in these former colonies, and sometimes against indigenous peoples in these former colonies. And then there's a term I came across in postcolonialism which is called foregrounding.
Foregrounding is a method where the most importance is given to a particular subject or set of circumstances. And in response to the issues raised by a study of the map, postcolonial international relations responds to these by foregrounding the history and politics of the colonies and how these contributed to the makeup of the modern world.
primary incentive for a lot of these countries to get involved had to do with economic incentives in specific markets or specific resources. So there already wasn't a lot of incentive to diversify the economy or to try to create strong institutions that might enable or encourage the colony to eventually become independent from the colonists. If anything, it was the opposite goal. So by nature of these relationships between the colonial state and the colony, you're going to have inequalities that naturally benefit the support of this construct of this system. So if we were to look at the mining industry, Mike, perhaps you could elaborate on how legislation was crafted to support institutions that would further encourage mining projects to operate successfully between colonies and colonizing states and later countries.
Many colonies in Africa were formed on the hunt for minerals. We've already talked a little bit on the section in realism about Cecil John Rhodes, who went into what is present-day Zimbabwe with a royal charter specifically to look for minerals. And a country like South Africa was endowed with huge resources in gold, platinum, and diamonds. An area like Latin America, Peru, and Bolivia was very, very rich in silver and gold, which attracted the conquistadors to those areas initially. And I think as those countries developed, a lot of the legislation that developed to allow the colonizing countries' companies to operate in those countries was developed in a way that created dependency. I think that dependency was a very, very huge factor in how the system worked, because those countries have been left in such a weakened state that they haven't been able to carry out the reforms and carry out the changes that are required to create a new law to suit the fact that they are the sovereign power. So they've just adopted legislation that's been around since colonial days. And eventually entities and institutions such as the World Bank and other institutions will catch up and change the law into a sovereign law.
If you even look at a country like, say, Papua New Guinea, right, where its first mining law came into being in the 1950s, they didn't make any edits to that colonial era law up until the 1990s. So well after the colonial era had passed, and yet the laws from that era remain. So there's clear ghosts, there's clear remnants, echoes of these former colonial trends that we continue to see today, and international relations attempts to explain or analyze why conflicts come into being. And while there's no one explanation for why a single individual chooses to go to war, a single individual chooses political protest, we can still point to long-term trends that have a clear impact or a clear relationship with complaints that people are currently registering. So in our previous discussion, we talked a lot about protests in the industry and movements against mine projects or attempts to stop a project in its operations. And if you were to look at the discourse used by people at protest sites or what have you, wouldn't you say that there's some element of a post-colonial mindset of people bringing historic grievances into ongoing concerns about a project?
I think that's certainly true, and it's something that mining companies need to be extremely aware of, is that despite the fact that sovereignty has been established in the country where the resources are, and despite the fact that independence has been achieved and the country exists in the international sphere, in the international order, the very fact that these very large mining companies are coming back in and creating further dependencies on their presence on these countries does smack to many people as a form of a recolonization or a neo-colonialism. And I think mining companies have to be very, very careful about this sort of appearance and make sure that their agendas are quite clear, that they're coming in as an independent company to basically partner with the host country to extract the resources in a fair and equitable manner. Sovereign countries are not particularly against the presence of foreign capital and against the presence of an industry owned by foreign companies exploiting their natural resources. What they're against is the fact that they're afraid of being impoverished by those activities, and then the foreign mining companies are being enriched by the same activities. So then you get this resource nationalism, where the only thing those countries can do is try and opt for a bigger piece of the pie. And the only way they can do that is to either ask for more taxes or more royalties, or to try and have a bigger participation in the local companies that are formed in their countries to exploit the resources, which obviously leads to a whole series of discussions, and very heated discussions and negotiations, and even to legal processes, because mining companies are in possession of documents and contracts and internationally binding agreements, and suddenly the host country, because it feels that it's being impoverished, wants to change those conditions, and this forms these two different camps. Tends to bring to light this spectre of neo-colonialism and these thoughts of post-colonialism, that people start to become resistant to the presence of major mining companies. I mean, and those things mining companies have to be extremely aware of, because on a very big scale, a scale is the way the deal is set, the way the deal is done with the government of the host country, that can become a big issue over time if this image of dependency and if this image of impoverishment is allowed to flourish. So mining companies need to be aware of that and basically form strategies and form relationships with the host government that show that that isn't the case.
It's easy to look at these major sort of countrywide decision-making processes as something that flies overhead, or these huge things that are impossible to take into account from a business model perspective or from a strategic planning viewpoint. And there is a way to account for it, right? There is a way to answer these questions from an industry perspective. And it revolves around coming aware first and foremost, right? So that's why we use theories so often to try to explain these really complex factors and the myriad different ways that a situation could be why it is. The more you're able to use theory, especially international relations theory, the more you're able to break these things apart and understand what trends might be sort of serving as an undercurrent for some of the mainstream megatrends that we continue to see impacting the industries.
I think one of the things as well about post-colonialism is it opens up a space to hear from marginalized perspectives or marginalized actors. What international relations does, and post-colonialism in particular does, is it encourages people to look from different aspects. It's just a way that you make people. Post-colonialism makes us think about the same situation in different ways, and that's the most important part.
This slide is an illustration of how international relations theories might foreground some issues in mining projects. The issues on the left are of the utmost importance to the mining company, and the issues on the right are of the utmost importance for the host community or perhaps the host government. On the left, we see all the rationalist issues that are very easily measurable for a mining company, such as its possession of mining rights, the existence of a legal contract, the drawing up of an EIA, the existence and negotiation of development agreements and access agreements, and a defined social program. These are issues which are very easy to measure and which mining companies like to achieve in a parallel or sequential fashion to advance the mining project. Those issues on the right are much more reflectivist and are mostly to do with how the receiving government or the receiving community might view the mining project. The desire for respect and the desire for recognition might be paramount in the host government. The community might be extremely concerned about the water issues that it may suffer, the loss of identity to do with its land, other fears and concerns about the ingress of strangers in the area, impacts on the environment, impacts on its rights and traditions. Will it get a chance to participate in the project? And does it trust that the players and actors from its own government and from the mining company that come into the area? These issues, illustrated by the foregrounding method, show the diversity of issues that impact a typical mining project. And the mining company should be very aware it has to give equal importance to the issues that are of the utmost importance to the community or government as it progresses with the project. And for this reason, foregrounding is an extremely useful tool to analyse the scope and breadth of communication and of thinking that needs to go into a typical large-scale modern mining project.
If you look at the post-colonial aspect of perspectivalism, look at the 20th century history. The 20th century history to most West-centric countries, or European countries in the United States, revolved around the First World War, the Second World War, and then the Cold War. But you look at the former colonies, probably their most important dates was the date of independence, or the date that they changed the constitution, something to do with the way that their country grew. But the relevance of those major conflicts that the Western countries focused on is not that great. And then we talk about the Cold War. The Cold War to Western countries in the USA was a Cold War because it was fought somewhere over there, mostly in former colonies. And there's some former colonies where the Cold War wasn't very cold at all. This perspectivalism, this ability to look at the opinions of other actors in the mining projects and the mining game is for me very important. For instance, in Peru, one may have to deal with communities that have been subject to violence during the Shining Path terrorist insurgency. And then suddenly a mining company is going to turn up and tell the same community, by the way, guys, what's under your feet belongs to us. It's in those sort of conditions that you have to try and understand how these people and how these communities are going to react.
If I'm looking to make a meal of some kind that requires a complex recipe, it doesn't make sense that I would cook that meal without the recipe book, right? In a similar notion, you wouldn't want to analyze protesters' demands about a certain environmental issue without environmental theory, or understand economic effects on a project without having some element of economic theory or an understanding of how markets work. So it just so happens that in our field, international relations theory is especially applicable because it uses all those different theories at once. So from our approach, we're able to actually garner all these different theories to be able to foreground our given conclusions in the best available data and an awareness of all the implications that a given demand might actually mean. And when you're able to create a business model that accounts for all those different factors, then your business model itself, your strategic growth imperative, is a lot more likely to be achieved.
Well, Jake, thanks very much for that. And once again, a very interesting discussion. And what we've decided is the next couple of sessions, we've talked about 5 international relations theories now. And I think both you and I agree it's time to try and see how we can apply those international relations theories to actual specific circumstances and projects to try and open up the world of mining to international relations theories. And I think it'd be very interesting to try and do that. Excellent. Thanks, Jake. I look forward to seeing you next week, and stay well.